She did not cry when she saw the dress. Crying was a luxury reserved for women who expected comfort to follow, and Philippa, Duchess of Thornfield, for precisely 3 months, expected none. The grand ballroom at Crestfall Manor glittered around her, a galaxy of chandeliers and jewels, but all light seemed to converge on a single point, on Estella Ingram, laughing by the marble hearth, and on the dress she wore. It was the silk that gave it away first, a whisper-light Spitalfields silk, the color of clotted cream, with a luster that seemed to hold the candlelight rather than merely reflect it. Philippa knew its texture without touching it, knew the precise weight of it, the faint, clean scent of the bolts from which it had been cut. She had chosen it with her mother a lifetime ago, in a sun-drenched London shop filled with the promise of a future that had since been comprehensively dismantled. Then came the lace, a delicate Honiton pattern of entwined ivy leaves and star-like blossoms, commissioned at great expense and with greater love. A design unique to her, a design now adorning the shoulders and wrists of her husband's mistress. No one else noticed. To the assembled nobility of Herefordshire, Miss Ingram was merely a vision of fashionable elegance. They saw a striking woman in a beautiful gown, her dark hair a perfect foil for the creamy silk. They saw the Duke of Thornfield, her host, standing near, his expression as impassive as the carved stone of the mantel behind him. They did not see the ghost of a bride. They did not see the quiet theft of a life that was supposed to have been. Philippa stood near a colonnade, a glass of untouched champagne in her hand, the cold of it seeping into her kidskin gloves. She had been speaking to a local baronet about the miserable state of the roads, her mind half engaged, her posture a study in ducal composure, but the sight of the dress had severed the thread of conversation, of thought, of everything but a cold, clarifying shock. It was not merely a dress. It was the dress, the one intended for a wedding that had become a hurried, sterile affair in a private chapel, for which she had worn a simple traveling suit of gray wool. The original ceremony, the grand union of the Wyndham and Caldwell families, had been cancelled upon her father's sudden death. The wedding dress, its creation a source of joy in her mother's final months, had been a casualty of grief and expediency. It was to have been packed away, a relic of a happiness that had never quite dawned. Instead, it was here, on Estella Ingram. She watched her husband, Alaric. He glanced towards Estella, and the smallest, most infinitesimal softening occurred at the corner of his mouth. It was a look she had never received. It was a look of familiarity, of shared history, of an intimacy that predated and utterly eclipsed her own presence in his life. He had married her for her name, for the lands that adjoined his own, and for the sizable dowry that would mend the leaking roofs of Crestfall Manor. He had been explicit about the terms of their union. It was a contract. He would be a correct, if distant, husband. He would give her his name and his protection. He would not, he had made clear in his clipped, precise way, give her his heart. That, it seemed, was already bestowed elsewhere. Philippa had accepted the terms. What choice did she have? An orphan with a crumbling estate and a name that was her only remaining currency. She had walked into the arrangement with her eyes open, expecting a life of quiet endurance, of polite emptiness. She had not expected this public, casual cruelty, this desecration. How had Estella even acquired it? The question was a small, sharp stone in the smooth surface of her shock. Had Alaric given it to her? The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Had he taken this one thing, this last remnant of her mother's love, and handed it to his mistress as a bauble, a trophy? Estella moved, the silk whispering over the polished floor. She approached a group of ladies, her smile bright and confident. She was telling a story, her hands gesturing, the ivy leaf lace at her wrists catching the light. Philippa could feel the weight of every eye in the room that was not on Miss Ingram, settling instead on her. The Duchess. The woman who stood alone while her husband's beautiful, celebrated mistress held court in the heart of her home. They would be pitying her, or worse, judging her for her failure to hold her husband's interest. She set her champagne glass down on a nearby table with a click that was too sharp in the sudden silence of her own mind. She would not be pitied. She would not be broken in her own ballroom. Her father, a man of quiet fortitude, had taught her that dignity was the one possession no one could take from you. It could only be surrendered. She would not surrender it. She straightened her spine. The pearls at her throat, her only adornment, felt cold against her skin. She began to walk, not towards her husband, not towards his mistress, but towards the Dowager Countess of Westling, a formidable old woman with eyes that missed nothing. She moved with a calm she did not feel, the train of her own modest blue silk gown a quiet shadow behind her. She would speak of the weather. She would inquire after the Countess's grandchildren. She would perform the duties of a duchess. She would exist, flawlessly, in the space they had allotted her. Inside, a decision was hardening, crystallizing from the cold shock into something diamond hard. This was not her life. This was a performance. And if she was to be an actress in her own home, she would, at the very least, take control of the stage. Crestfall Manor would be her theater, and she would learn her part so well that no one, not even the Duke, would recognize the woman he thought he had married. The months that followed the ball were a study in gray monotony, punctuated by the sharp, bright pain of Estella Ingram's continued presence in their lives. She did not return to Crestfall, but when the Duke was in London, Philippa knew he was with her. The knowledge was a constant low hum beneath the surface of her days. She received his brief, impersonal letters from town, detailing his political business, and sent equally brief, impersonal replies detailing the household accounts. Theirs was a marriage conducted by post, a partnership of ink and paper. In his absence, Crestfall became her world. The manor was a magnificent beast of a house, a sprawling Tudor heart with Georgian wings, beautiful and deeply neglected. It bled money. The tenants were disgruntled, the fields fallow, the roofs, as Alaric had noted, in a state of perpetual decay. The estate was a mirror of their marriage, a grand facade hiding a slow, inexorable collapse. Philippa did not know where to begin. She only knew she could not bear the idleness, the waiting. She could not sit in the drawing room doing needlepoint while the life she was supposed to be living happened elsewhere, to someone else. Her father had believed a lady should understand her own affairs. While other girls of her station were learning watercolors and the pianoforte, he had sat with her in his study, explaining ledgers and land leases. He had called it practical magic, the art of turning earth and ink into security. At the time, she had found it dry. Now, it felt like a weapon. She began in the estate office, a dusty, forgotten room at the back of the house. The agent, a Mr. Finchley, was old and complacent, his books a chaotic mess of blotched entries and missing receipts. He treated her with a weary condescension, patting her hand and assuring her that these were not matters for a lady's delicate mind. "The Duke has always left these things to me, Your Grace," he said, his tone implying that the Duke's wisdom in this was unassailable. "The Duke is in London," Philippa replied, her voice quiet but unyielding. "And the estate is here. I wish to understand it. Please, Bring me the records for the last 5 years. She spent a week in that dusty room with only a taciturn housemaid named Nan to bring her tea and build up the fire. The chill of the stone walls seeped into her bones, but a different kind of fire was kindling within her. The ledgers told a story of mismanagement, of laziness, of opportunities squandered. Rents uncollected, fields left to sour, timber sold for a fraction of its worth. Finchley was not a thief, she concluded, merely an incompetent. She started with the home farm. She walked the fields, her half-boots sinking into the damp Herefordshire soil. She spoke to the farmers, men with weathered faces and skeptical eyes, who were accustomed to being ignored by the great house. At first they were guarded, offering clipped, non-committal answers. But Philippa did not ask questions like a lady making polite conversation. She asked about drainage and soil composition, about crop yields and the price of feed. She listened. She took notes in a small leather-bound book. Slowly they began to talk. They spoke of a waterlogged lower meadow that had once been the best grazing land, its culverts now choked with silt. They spoke of the North Woods, where poachers took deer with impunity because the gamekeepers were too old or too drunk to patrol. They spoke of cottages with leaking thatch that Mr. Finchley had promised to repair for 3 winters running. She returned to the house, her mind whirring with information. She spent her evenings in the vast, cold library, not with novels, but with books on agriculture and estate law she'd had sent from London. She read about new methods of crop rotation, about land enclosure, about animal husbandry. The language was dense, technical, but it was a language of solutions, of order, of possibility. It was the opposite of the chaotic, emotional turmoil of her marriage. Here, in these pages, was a world that made sense. A problem identified could be a problem solved. She drew up a plan. It was modest at first. She hired a new, younger gamekeeper. She used a portion of her own dowry, the part Alaric had not yet requisitioned for the main roof, to pay a team of local men to clear the culverts in the lower meadow. She personally oversaw the purchase of new breeding stock for the sheep, choosing a hardy local breed over the fashionable but delicate merino the old agent had favored. Mr. Finchley was aghast. He wrote to the Duke, long, rambling letters full of veiled complaints about the Duchess's interference. Philippa knew this because Alaric forwarded one to her, with a single, cold sentence scrawled at the bottom. "Pray do not vex Mr. Finchley. He has served my family for 40 years. She stared at the letter, the sharp, angular script so like the man himself. He had not asked for her side of the story. He had not inquired as to her reasoning. He had simply issued a command from on high, siding with the incompetent man who was running his birthright into the ground. For a moment, the old despair threatened to surface. The futility of it all. What was she doing? Playing at being a duchess in an empty house, while her husband amused himself in London and dismissed her efforts with the flick of a pen? But then, the anger returned. Not a hot, useless fury, but a cold, clear resolve. He had called their marriage a contract. Very well. Her part of the contract was to be the Duchess of Thornfield. And the Duchess of Thornfield, as she understood it, was the custodian of this land, this house, these people. She was upholding her end of the bargain. He could not fault her for that. She wrote back to him, her own handwriting a neat, precise counterpoint to his slashings. Mr. Finchley is a loyal servant, but his methods are outdated. The estate is losing money it cannot afford to lose. I am merely ensuring the viability of your assets, Your Grace. It is, I believe, my duty. She did not wait for a reply. She dismissed Mr. Finchley, giving him a generous pension and a cottage on the edge of the estate. He left in a cloud of aggrieved dignity. In his place, she hired a younger man from Shropshire, a Mr. Sorrel, whose letters of recommendation spoke of intelligence, diligence, and a forward-thinking approach to agriculture. Mr. Sorrel was a quiet, serious man, with honest eyes and work-roughened hands. He did not treat her like a fragile lady or a meddling fool. He treated her like an employer. He listened to her ideas, offered his own, and debated points of strategy with a refreshing directness. Together they pored over maps and ledgers, planning the restoration of Crestfall not in terms of months, but of years. A 5-year plan, a 10-year plan. For the first time since her marriage, Philippa felt a sense of purpose that was entirely her own. She was not the neglected wife. She was not the object of pity. She was the woman who was saving Crestfall Manor. She worked from dawn until long after the house had settled into silence, the only light a single lamp in the vast library, her companion a stack of books, and the quiet scratch of her pen. She was building a life within the ruins of the one she had been promised. It was a colder, harder life, but it was hers. And in the quiet satisfaction of a balanced ledger or a mended roof, she found a strange, resilient kind of peace. The first sign of the thaw came not as a torrent, but as a single drop of water on a frozen pane. It was late autumn, nearly a year into her marriage. Alaric had returned from London unexpectedly, his arrival announced by the crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel drive. Philippa was in the library, a thick shawl around her shoulders, her fingers smudged with ink as she finalized the accounts for the quarter. She heard the commotion in the hall but did not rise. Her husband's comings and goings were his own affair. He found her there, bent over the great oak table, a dozen ledgers open around her. He stopped in the doorway, and for a long moment simply watched her. She felt his presence before she saw him, a shift in the air, a sudden tension. She looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "Your Grace," she said, her voice even. "We were not expecting you." "Evidently," he replied. His eyes scanned the table, taking in the sea of paper, the neat columns of figures, the maps marked with her precise script. He looked different. Thinner, perhaps. A new line of strain was etched between his brows. "Mrs. Finch tells me you spend all your time in here. I had assumed she met with novels." "Novels do not mend fences, nor do they pay wages," Philippa said, her gaze dropping back to her work. She would not be baited into a defensive posture. What she did here was her own business. He walked into the room, his boots silent on the thick Persian rug. He picked up one of the ledgers. It was the book for the tenanted farms, the one she had painstakingly reconstructed from Finchley's chaotic notes. He flipped through the pages. She had implemented a new system, cross-referencing rents paid against repairs requested and work completed. It was clear, logical, and efficient. "Sorrel's work?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Mr. Sorrel implements the system. I designed it," she said, not looking up. He was silent for so long that she finally raised her eyes. He was staring at the page, but his focus seemed to be somewhere else entirely. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, uncertain. "The income from the North Farms is up by 20%, he stated. It was not a question. "We renegotiated the leases with the larger tenants and invested in draining the upper fields. Mr. Sorrel believes we can expect a similar increase next year." He closed the ledger and placed it back on the table, exactly where he had found it. The gesture was deliberate, precise. "I see." He left the library without another word. But something had changed. The letter of dismissal he had surely come to deliver to Mr. Sorrel remained unwritten. The cold command to cease her work was never issued. He did not approve, not yet. But he did not interfere. It was the first concession he had ever made to her. A small, unclaimed territory of respect. Over the next few months, he began to watch her. She would be walking the grounds with Sorel, discussing the placement of a new hedgerow, and would look up to see him observing them from a window. She would be meeting with a delegation of tenants in the hall, and he would pass through, his pace slowing, his head inclined as if to catch their words. He said nothing, but he saw. He saw the cottages with sound roofs and freshly limed walls. He saw the fatter cattle in the newly green water meadows. He heard the change in the tenants' tone when they spoke of the Duchess, a grudging respect that was warming into genuine loyalty. This was not the ornamental, biddable girl he had married. This was a stranger wearing his wife's face. The true turning point, however, came with the winter storms. A brutal spell of weather swept in from the Welsh mountains, bringing with it days of relentless, freezing rain. The River Lug, which bordered the estate's western edge, began to swell. Philippa and Sorel had spent weeks preparing, reinforcing the old levees and clearing debris from the waterways, but the sheer volume of water was unprecedented. One night, the river broke its banks. A torrent of muddy water surged across the low-lying fields, threatening the village of Crestfall-on-Lug, where most of the estate workers lived. Word reached the manor just after midnight, a frantic groom hammering on the great oak door. Philippa was awake instantly. She dressed in practical woolens and sturdy boots, her mind already racing through contingency plans. When she came downstairs, she found Alaric in the hall, shrugging on a heavy oilskin coat. He looked at her, his expression grim. "This is no place for you," he said. It was the old, dismissive tone. "Go back to bed. I will handle it." "Those are my people out there as well as yours," she retorted, her chin lifting. "And I know every family, every cottage, and every path in that village. Do you?" He had no answer to that. The truth of her words hung in the air between them. He was the Duke, the owner of all he surveyed, but he was a stranger to his own lands. She was the one who had walked them, who had listened, who knew. They rode out together into the storm, a small party of men following with lanterns and ropes. The scene in the village was one of chaos and terror. The water was waist-deep in the lower lanes, swirling with debris. Families were trapped in their cottages, their panicked shouts barely audible over the roar of the flood. Alaric was a man of action. He began organizing the evacuation, his voice a calm, authoritative command in the darkness. But it was Philippa who directed the efforts. "The widow Maeve's cottage will go first. Her roof is the weakest," she'd call out. "Take the boat to the weaver's house. His wife is with child. Mr. Sorrel, the north bank is holding for now. We can move people to the church." She moved through the cold, swirling water without hesitation, her face lashed by rain, her skirts heavy with mud. She helped carry children to safety, reassured frightened women, and directed the men to the most vulnerable spots. Alaric found himself watching her again, but this time with a raw, undisguised astonishment. He saw not a duchess, not a lady, but a leader. She was fearless, competent, and possessed of a quiet, unshakable strength he had never suspected. By dawn, the worst was over. The rain had eased, and the floodwaters began to recede. Every villager was accounted for, huddled in the relative safety of the church and the manor's great hall. Philippa stood on the crest of a small hill, looking down at the devastation. She was soaked to the bone, shivering with cold and exhaustion, but her eyes were clear. Alaric came to stand beside her. He had a flask of brandy in his hand and a blanket over his arm. He didn't speak, just draped the thick wool over her shoulders and handed her the flask. She took a sip, the fiery liquid a welcome shock to her system. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the gray morning light reveal the extent of the damage. The landscape was a ruin of mud and water. "It will take years to recover," she said, her voice rough with fatigue. "We will recover," he said. And the word "we" was new. It was not the royal "we" of a duke, but the shared pronoun of a partnership. He looked at her, and for the first time, his eyes were stripped of their cold defenses. He was looking at her, at Philippa, and what he saw there seemed to shake him to his core. "You saved them," he said, his voice quiet. "I give orders. You knew what to do." It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact, a confession of his own blindness. And in that moment, standing in the cold dawn amidst the wreckage of his estate, Philippa felt the first tentative flicker of something she had long believed to be extinguished. It was not hope, not yet. It was something far more fragile. It was a possibility. The possibility that the man beside her might one day be worth the trouble of knowing. The aftermath of the flood became the new foundation of their marriage. The shared crisis had stripped away the layers of polite artifice, leaving them with a raw, unspoken truth. Crestfall needed them both. The work of rebuilding was immense, and for the first time, Alaric did not retreat to London. He stayed. He began to join her in the library in the evenings. At first, he would sit in a wing-back chair by the fire, ostensibly reading a political journal, while she worked at the great table. But his eyes were rarely on the page. He watched her, watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the decisive tap of her pen as she made a note. Then he started asking questions. "Sorel mentioned a plan for a new levy system. Show me," he said one evening, his voice startling her out of her calculations. She hesitated, then unrolled the surveyor's maps. She explained her proposal, a more ambitious system of embankments and spillways, pointing out the weaknesses in the old design. He listened intently, his gaze sharp and focused. He asked technical questions, challenging her assumptions, forcing her to defend her logic. It was not an interrogation, but a debate between equals. He saw a flaw in her plan for the southern sluice gate and proposed an alternative that was demonstrably better. She conceded the point without argument. That night, for the first time, he pulled a chair up to the table and worked beside her, his own notes on engineering filling the page next to her financial projections. The silence between them was no longer a void of distance, but a comfortable space of shared purpose. The library, once her solitary sanctuary, became their joint headquarters. He learned the names of his tenants. He rode out with Sorel to inspect the damage firsthand, and when he spoke to the farmers, he listened to their answers. He saw the respect they afforded Philippa, the way they deferred to her judgment. He began to understand that her authority was not derived from her title, but earned through her actions. He never spoke of Estella Ingram. Her name was a ghost that lingered in the London house, but it did not follow him to Crestfall. He burned the invitations that arrived from town, tossing them into the library fire without comment. Philippa watched the embossed cards curl and blacken, the names of hostesses she would never meet turning to ash. It was a quiet, symbolic dismantling of a life he no longer seemed to want. But the past was not so easily erased. One afternoon, a large crate arrived from London. It was delivered to Philippa's private sitting room. Nan helped her pry it open. Inside, swathed in layers of tissue paper, was a bolt of the most exquisite silver-gray silk, and another of gossamer lace, finer than any she had ever seen. Tucked into the folds was a note in Alaric's hand. "A new gown for the winter balls. I would be honored if you would accompany me to London next month." Philippa stared at the lavish gift. It was an offering, an apology, a request, all at once. It was his attempt to replace what had been stolen. But the wound was not a dress. The wound was the casual disregard, the profound blindness that had allowed the theft to happen. A new piece of silk, could not mend that. She left the crate untouched. He found it there a week later, still open, the silks gleaming softly in the firelight. He said nothing, but the line of strain returned to his jaw. He had offered a gift, and she had refused it. He did not understand. He thought the problem was a material one, something that could be rectified with a sufficient application of funds. He did not yet grasp that the currency between them was not money, but trust. And his account was deeply overdrawn. The tension between them grew, a taut, invisible wire. The easy companionship of their work faltered. He became formal again, retreating behind the ducal mask. He felt rebuffed, his gesture of peace thrown back in his face. She felt misunderstood, her pain trivialized into a matter of fabric and thread. The breaking point came with the news of her father's estate. The final settlement of his debts had been a long and complicated process, and the news from her solicitor was grim. After everything was paid, there was almost nothing left. The Caldwell name was intact, but the fortune that had propped it up was gone. Her dowry, the very thing that had made her a suitable match for a duke, had been the last of it. She was, for all intents and purposes, penniless. She received the letter in the morning and said nothing. She carried the knowledge with her all day, a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. It confirmed her deepest fear. Her only value to him had been her fortune. Now that it was gone, what was she? A barren wife, a woman he had never wanted, with no assets to her name but a title. That evening, he found her again in the library. She was not working. She was standing by the window, staring out at the rain-lashing darkness, her arms wrapped around herself. "Philippa?" he said. He had never used her given name before. It sounded strange, foreign, in the quiet room. "My father's estate is settled," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "The solicitors have informed me there is nothing left. The dowry you received was the last of it." She turned to face him, her eyes dark in her pale face. "The contract, I'm afraid, has been rendered void. You appear to have made a bad bargain, Your Grace." The quiet devastation in her voice, the bitter self-deprecation, finally broke through his pride. He saw her then, not as a duchess, not as an estate manager, but as a woman who believed herself to be worthless, a woman he had made to feel worthless. "A bad bargain?" he repeated, his voice hoarse. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping just before her. He looked down at her, and his face was a mask of self-reproach. "My God, is that what you think this has become? A matter of accounts?" "It is what it has always been," she said, refusing to look away. "You were very clear about the terms." "I was a fool," he said, the words torn from him. "I was a blind, arrogant fool. Do you think I have not seen what you have done here? You have taken a dying estate and breathed life into it. You have earned the loyalty of my people. You have faced disaster with more courage than any man I know. And you think your value lies in a bag of gold?" He reached out, not to touch her, but to gesture at the ledgers on the table. "That is your dowry, your intelligence, your strength. That is the fortune you brought to this house. A fortune I was too stupid to recognize." The raw honesty in his voice was more shocking than any anger would have been. Philippa stared at him, her carefully constructed composure beginning to fracture. "Why?" she whispered. "Why were you like that? The coldness. Her." She could not say Estella's name. She could not speak of the dress. He flinched as if she had struck him. He turned away from her, walking to the fireplace and resting his arm on the mantel, his back to her. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, freighted with a history she had never known. "Before you," he began, "there was someone else. Lady Anne. It was not a contract. I loved her. Or I thought I did. Our families were delighted. The wedding was planned. 2 weeks before the day, she eloped with my cousin. She left a note. It said that she could not bring herself to marry a man who was so emotionally costive, a man whose only passion was for his duties." He fell silent. The only sound was the hiss and crackle of the fire. "She was right," he continued, still not looking at her. "My father had raised me to be the Duke, to put duty before all else. Feeling was a liability. So I made a policy of it. I resolved never again to be made a fool of by sentiment. I built a fortress around myself, and called it principle." He finally turned to face her, his eyes bleak with a pain that was years old. "And then I met Estella. She was uncomplicated. She understood the world as I did, a series of transactions. There was no pretense of love. It was an arrangement of convenience and amusement. It was safe." "And me?" Philippa's voice was barely audible. "You were a duty," he said, the words brutal in their honesty. "A suitable match, a means to an end. I married you with the full intention of keeping you at a distance, of never allowing you to breach the walls. I treated you not as a wife, but as an acquisition. And I allowed Estella to humiliate you in this very house. An act of such profound cruelty and disrespect that I can barely speak of it." He finally met her eyes, and all the pride, all the ducal arrogance was gone. He was just a man, laid bare by his own failures. "The dress," he said, his voice thick with shame. "I never knew about the dress until months later. A slip of the tongue from her maid, overheard by my valet. Estella had arranged it with your former modiste. A bribe, a lie about a change of plans. She wanted to show you, and everyone else, her place in my life. She wanted to break you." He took a step closer, and I, in my damnable blindness, let her. I saw a beautiful woman in a pretty gown. I did not see the weapon she was wielding. I did not see the wound she was inflicting on you. Because I was not looking at you, Philippa. I had never truly looked at you at all." He stopped before her, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. "I cannot excuse my actions. They are inexcusable. I can only tell you that the man who made that bargain a year ago no longer exists. You have changed me. You have changed everything. And the thought of you believing for 1 second that your worth is tied to your father's money, it is a dishonor I will not permit." He had offered no easy apology. He had offered something far more difficult. The truth. A full, unvarnished confession of his own profound and damaging folly. Philippa stood in the firelight, the story of his past echoing in the quiet room, and felt the last of her own defenses begin to crumble. The cold, hard shell she had built around her heart had been breached, not by a declaration of love, but by an admission of truth. The truth of his wound, and the truth of the one he had, in his blindness, inflicted upon her. Trust, she knew, was not rebuilt in a moment. It was a slow, painstaking process. Like the rebuilding of the flood-torn levees, one stone at a time. But for the first time, standing before her husband in the quiet library, she felt that the work might be worth undertaking. He had finally seen her, and in doing so, he had finally allowed himself to be seen. The confession in the library was not an end, but a beginning. It cleared the air of ghosts, but it did not magically mend the fractures in the foundation of their marriage. Alaric seemed to understand this. He did not press her for an immediate absolution she could not give. Instead, he began the slow, patient work of earning her trust, not with grand gestures or lavish gifts, but with small, consistent acts of consideration. He started bringing her a cup of tea in the mornings when he knew she had worked late the night before. He would listen, truly listen, when she spoke of her day, asking questions that showed he had retained the details. When a letter arrived from Estella Ingram, he brought it to Philippa, the seal unbroken. "I believe this is for you to read first," he said, placing it on the table beside her. "There can be no more secrets between us." Philippa's fingers trembled slightly as she broke the wax. The letter was what she expected, a mixture of pleading, recrimination, and veiled threats about social ruin. Estella could not comprehend that Alaric's affections had not simply been transferred to another woman, but that his entire way of being in the world had shifted. She was trying to fight a war that was already over, using weapons that no longer had any power. Philippa read the letter, then handed it back to him. "What will you do?" she asked. "What we should have done a year ago," he replied. He walked to the fireplace and dropped the letter into the flames. They watched it burn together. He began to draw her out of her self-imposed isolation at Crestfall. He did not suggest the London season, knowing it held only painful memories. Instead, he proposed a trip to the Lake District, to see the mountains in their autumn colors. It was not a grand tour, but a quiet journey for two. They stayed in modest inns, walked for miles through the fells, and spoke more in those 2 weeks than they had in the entire first year of their marriage. He told her about his childhood, about the immense pressure of being the heir, about his passion for architecture that had been sublimated into the dry duty of managing his inheritance. She, in turn, told him about her parents, about her love for botany, about the quiet, scholarly life she had once imagined for herself. They were two strangers, slowly, cautiously, becoming friends. The physical distance between them began to shrink. One evening, as they sat before the fire in a small inn in Grassmere, he reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. His touch was hesitant, questioning. She did not pull away. His fingers laced with hers, a silent acknowledgement of a new and fragile connection. Upon their return to Crestfall, the rhythm of their life settled into a new pattern. They were a team. The estate became their shared project, a physical manifestation of the relationship they were building. They planned, they argued, they compromised. They celebrated small victories, a successful harvest, a new tenant signing a fair lease, the final repair of the flood-damaged bridge, with a shared look of satisfaction across the dinner table. One day, while clearing out a disused storeroom, they found a collection of old portfolios. They were filled with architectural drawings, beautifully rendered in ink and wash. They were Alaric's. Plans for a new library wing, designs for a conservatory, sketches for cottages that were both practical and elegant. They were the work of a man with a genuine talent and a deep love for his home. "I did these when I was at Oxford," he said, a faint flush on his cheeks. "Before my father convinced me it was an unsuitable pastime for a future duke." Philippa looked from the drawings to her husband. She saw the ghost of the young man he had been, before duty and heartbreak had calcified him. "They are magnificent," she said, her voice soft, with a sincerity that was undeniable. "Alaric, why are we not building this?" She tapped the drawing of the conservatory. "The south wall of the garden is perfect." It would be a place to cultivate the more delicate plants. He looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his face, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his severe features. "An excellent suggestion, Your Grace," he said, the formal title now laced with a warm, private irony. The construction of the conservatory became their passion. It was a structure of glass and light, a testament to a future they were building together. Alaric oversaw the design and engineering, his old passion rekindled. Philippa planned the interior, sourcing exotic plants and designing the layout of the beds. It was a true collaboration. The day it was finished, they stood inside, the late afternoon sun streaming through the glass panes, the air warm and fragrant with the scent of damp earth and flowering jasmine. The world outside was muted, distant. Inside this glass house, they had created a sanctuary. Alaric turned to her. He did not have a gift in his hand. He did not have a prepared speech. He had only the quiet truth in his eyes. "I know I can never replace what was lost," he began, his voice low. "I cannot give you back your mother, or the joy of that first wedding dress. That is a desecration that will always be a part of our story." He took a deep breath. "But I can promise you this. Every day for the rest of my life, I will endeavor to be a husband worthy of the woman who stood in the floodwaters. The woman who saved this house. The woman who, God help me, has saved me from myself." He reached out and gently touched her cheek. "I love you, Philippa. Not for your dowry, or your name, or your competence. I love you for your courage, for your goodness, for the quiet, unyielding strength of your heart." Tears welled in Philippa's eyes. Not tears of grief or humiliation, but tears of a profound, overwhelming relief. The words she had never expected to hear, spoken with an honesty that was absolute. "I believe you," she whispered, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that it was true. He did not kiss her then. Instead, he led her to a small wooden bench in the corner of the conservatory. He sat beside her, took her hand, and simply held it as the sun set, casting long shadows through their house of glass. It was not a dramatic conclusion, but a quiet settling. A promise not of a life without scars, but of a life where those scars could, at last, begin to heal. The silence was not empty. It was full of peace. 5 years later, the conservatory was a lush, thriving jungle of green. Sunlight, filtered through the broad leaves of a fig tree, dappled the stone floor where a small boy of 3 was intently arranging pebbles into a line. He had Alaric's dark, serious eyes and Philippa's determined chin. Philippa sat on the bench, a book open in her lap, though she was watching her son, Thomas, more than reading. A comfortable quiet filled the warm, fragrant air. The door opened, and Alaric entered, brushing soil from his hands. He had been in the rose garden with the head gardener, debating the merits of a new French hybrid. His face was weathered by the sun, the severe lines of his youth softened into a settled contentment. He smiled as he saw his son, and came to sit beside Philippa, dropping a light kiss on her hair. "The pebble accounts appear to be in order," he murmured, his eyes twinkling. "He is a very methodical child," Philippa replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "He gets it from his father." "He gets his resilience from his mother," Alaric countered softly, his arm coming around her. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their son play. Crestfall was thriving. The tenants were prosperous, the land was healthy, and the house itself, once a place of cold duty, was now a warm, living home. Their home. Their marriage was not a fairy tale. It was something quieter, stronger, built on a foundation of salvaged respect and hard-won trust. There were still days when the ghost of the past would surface, a careless word from a visitor, a mention of a name, and a shadow would pass between them. But it was only a shadow, no longer a wall. They had learned to speak of it, to acknowledge the scar tissue that was part of their story. Later that evening, after Thomas was asleep, they sat in the library. It was their favorite room, the heart of their partnership. A fire burned low in the grate. Alaric was reading from a book of poetry, his voice a low, pleasant rumble in the quiet room. Philippa was mending a small tear in one of Thomas's shirts. It was a scene of such profound domestic peace that it sometimes still took her breath away. Alaric paused in his reading and looked at her. "Do you remember that first night I found you in here, drowning in Finchley's ledgers? I remember wondering when you were going to dismiss Mr. Sorrel," she said with a small smile. "I almost did," he admitted. "I had the letter half written. I was furious that you had gone against my wishes. But then I saw your handwriting in those books, the clarity of it, the intelligence, and I realized I was not angry at you for your interference. I was angry at myself for not having seen it sooner, for not having seen you." He reached across and took the mending from her hands, setting it aside. He held her hands in his thumb stroking her knuckles. "Thank you, Philippa," he said. "For what?" she asked, puzzled. "For balancing the books?" "No," he said, his gaze serious and full of a deep, abiding love. "For not giving up, on this house or on me." She brought his hand to her lips and kissed it. "We made a good bargain in the end, Your Grace." He smiled, the smile she had come to cherish, the one that was hers alone. "Indeed we did, my love. Indeed we did." Outside, a soft rain began to fall, pattering against the tall library windows. But inside, there was only warmth and the quiet, steady light of a love that had been tested by fire and flood, and had, against all odds, endured. The house was safe, the land was healing, and they, at long last,